It's my pleasure to introduce Amy, who will be presenting today, and another thanks to Deanna for sorting out all the technical things, and for to Eve. So Amy's seminar will be on is titled Inquiring about Freedom, Networks of Resistance and Confrontation of Women of Colour in Tortola, 1807 to 1828. And Amy is an incoming PhD student at the University of Leeds, funded by the White Rose College of Arts and Humanities. Her project is titled Testifying Through Terror, Reading Resistance in the Testimonial Voices of Enslaved People During Conspiración de la Escalera. I hope I got that right. She will utilize legal and trial records to examine the African identities and experiences that shape resistance within the 1844 investigations, resistance of a supposed slave uprising in Cuba, known as Conspiración de la Escalera. Amy recently concluded Leeds' MA in Race and Resistance program. Her thesis, supervised by Professor Manuel Barcia, explored the interconnected networks of support and hierarchy between women of colour on Tortola during the early 19th century. Amy recently presented this research at the Society for Caribbean Studies postgraduate conference. Amy's primary research interests are intersectional histories of the Caribbean and African diaspora, specifically focusing on gendered resistance, testimony, and voice. So I'll hand over to Amy now to start. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to play from start. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep, all good.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, cool. Excellent. So before I start, I just want to say a big thank you to Eve, Sabrina, and Deanna for supporting the session today, and to the Centre of Latin American and Caribbean Studies for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And just add a small trigger warning for some of the content and the context to follow. There is reference to violence and exploitation in some of the primary sources and experiences that I'm going to refer to. So just if anybody needs a break from that, that's absolutely fine. So my research today that I'm going to be presenting is titled Inquiring about Freedom, Networks of Resistance and Confrontation of Women of Colour in Tortola between 1807 and 1828. Now, the 1807 Act of Abolition decreed that the transatlantic trade of Africans should be abolished. In reality, enslaved peoples were taken from condemned ships across the Atlantic and bound as apprentices, imperial commodities to the British Empire. It was simply another form of servitude. Kidnapped Africans were treated as movable property from the moment of condemnation. The manipulative allures of the title Liberated African were starkly juxtaposed to the realities of unfreedom that are better represented by the term kidnapped African, and this is what I'm going to be using today. Okay, so between 1807 and 1828, 1,300 illegally transported Africans were apprenticed at Tortola in the British Virgin Islands. British bureaucracy responded with the Commission of Enquiry, conceived to investigate the state and condition of kidnapped Africans. On Tortola, Commissioners John Dougan and Major Thomas Moody's examinations, which took place from 1821 to 1828, produced what historian Anita Ruprecht labelled enforced narratives. It documented swathes of women's voices and experiences across varied statuses, enslaved, apprenticed, and free. This project sought to explore both reports of commissioners of inquiry from the UK parliamentary papers, as well as Colonial Office and Custom Office records at the National Archives, to name a few, but those are what I'm going to be mainly talking about today. These strongly illustrated how kidnapped Africans articulated their own freedom, and when approaching these sources, I've maintained a really sensitive awareness of how my own position when in the National Archives as a young white woman really shaped my interpretations, and ensuring steadfast focus on the experiences of these women, what I'm hoping to emphasise their importance and power, and really create a space in this presentation that's really solely dedicated to them. Now, thinking briefly about methodology, James Scott's concept of the hidden transcript of resistance was really key to my project. The Commission archive represented a voluminous array of colonial domination, within which the hidden transcript of kidnapped African women was existed in swathes, articulated fervently, but it was disguised amidst the rigid numerical categorisation of the Tortola Schedules. So building on the impressive array of scholarship by people like Hilary Beckles, Laura Roseanne Adderley, Sean Kelly, Kimberly Hanger, Danielle Trazis-Williams, Jessica Johnson, and most significantly, Anita Ruprecht, who's worked on Tortola, this research offers a necessary deepening of the gendered experiences of hierarchy, collaboration, and resistance of women across stratified statuses in the early 19th century. And Ruprecht's instrumental work on the Commission and the unfreedom of kidnapped Africans argued that on Tortola, boundaries of colonial labour were, quote, redrawn from below. And although hierarchical relationships certainly warrant attention as the patriarchal power structures to be resisted, the network of female apprentices explored here indicate a different redefinition. Rather, these women resisted drawing power hierarchies from within dominant networks that controlled labour. This interconnection was fundamental to the conduct, complexity, and curtailing of their resistance. And so, using women's voices as raw material here, I argued that a gendered entanglement of stratified female resistance networks emerged from within masculine colonial networks. These developed against and in spite of a violent power hierarchy fracturing under political and religious tensions in the early 19th century. This builds on the work of Hilary Beckles, who emphasised that a focus on the, quote, woman perspective showed how feminist infrastructure emerged from within a, quote, masculinist enterprise of colonialism. And within this enterprise themselves, the extensive, often disputed writings of Dougan and Moody documented a mosaic of female networks negotiating on freedom. Resistance, collaboration, and hierarchy coexist here through my exploration of the interconnected lives of women of colour on Tortola. Now, I want to start by thinking and introducing the case study and the women that really started this project for me. 21-year-old Mokwo was an apprentice to Henry Clinton McLean, who was the Comptroller of Customs on Tortola, and she was placed on his cotton plantation, Quays Manor. On the 24th of May, 1822, she made her first complaint against McLean. She argued that she was employed in hard labour, cutting bushes and doing cotton works, something that was prohibited for female apprentices, and that she possessed insufficient food and clothing, and that he, quote, licked her with a cowskin. Mokwa was not the only kidnapped African connected to McLean to make such complaints. Alongside her, testimonies of Adeka, Imbahawa, Mborio, Ajogo entered this network of female apprentices into the personal and bureaucratic battlefield of the Commission. As a result, an extensive investigation ensued, often at the centre of increasing quarrels between Moody and Dougan. This conflict actually persisted for 2 years until it was concluded by Commissioners Bowles and Barron in June 1824, who actually were brought in from Antigua to adjudicate this. And the case actually outlived Dougan himself. He passed away before it was concluded. In the Commission archive, the interconnected overlapping relationships between these women and McLean, as well as the numerous witnesses he produced, was apparent. Within these blurred boundaries, battles and confrontations emerged over labour, provisions, and treatment, creating space for Mokwo and Adeka to recast their experience of apprenticeship. Each woman described severe labour and being ill-fed, and the whippings that they received as punishment. Dougan's initial statement of facts positioned these women and, quote, those who all complained as a chorus of voices speaking against their situation as apprentices. The hidden transcript of this interconnected network thus gained power in its collectivity, perhaps giving each woman the strength to resist in front of McLean himself in the space in front of him. And the power of their network's collective resistance was apparent in McLean's response to the commissioners. He responded both bureaucratically and violently, telling the commissioners that, quote, in consequence of the lies, he had whipped 2 of them with tamarind rods. In his attack on their claims, McLean recognised and exposed the threatening capabilities of this female network. He cited the, quote, injustice that he experienced being the target of accusations that his female apprentices had, quote, combined to tell so many. He claimed that Adeka had only complained because she had acquainted herself with Mokwo's examination and was therefore, quote, induced to make similar complaints. McLean positioned their support for one another and mutual desire to be taken from him as the real issue. Again, McLean's accusations affirmed the power in collective complaints as the women echoed each other to confront the dominant voice. He specifically presented Imbahawa as a ringleader and that she had, quote, persuaded Mokwo and Adeka to leave his service to live in town with those who had harboured them when they ran away. Presenting the friendship between Moko and Imbahawa as the primary reason for her complaints, MacLean hoped to dismantle their network from above. He took on a leader that he chose, prescribing hierarchy to their female network. In addition to this violence, in his bureaucratic response, MacLean assembled 6 affidavits in his own defence. This included 3 members of his own family, Elizabeth Lettison, Francis MacLean, and John Lettison, his father-in-law, 2 kidnapped Africans, Onogo and Ijogo, whom belonged to Lettison and his wife Frances MacLean respectively, and Rose Grimes, a free woman of colour. Their assembly reflected the familial network that MacLean relied upon, one that mirrored imperial bureaucracies. And so, in their battle, Moko and Adeka not only worked within systems of colonial authority to resist their position, but also confronted a network that fundamentally mirrored the ideologies and hierarchies of British imperialism. In this sense, MacLean utilised his own familial network, which was intimately mapped onto these imperial power hierarchies, to confront this female network. The affidavits illustrated a dominant means of articulation through which he countered any attempts to express a hidden transcript of resistance. And taking a wider perspective, these hierarchical networks were combined with an atmosphere of corruption on Tortola. MacLean held 3 women without official indentureship contracts, a common occurrence, and took part in improper apprenticeship transfers within his familial network, particularly with his father-in-law. It indicated a coordinated effort to control kidnapped Africans. For instance, the involvement of Onogo, Ijogo, and Grimes' testimonies supporting MacLean illustrated the intermingled nature of colonial and apprentice networks and added complexity to any assumptions of a blanket female support structure at Quay's Manor. However, women like Imbahawa, Moko, and Adeka moved within these interconnected familial networks to resist and reject their exploitation. In confronting MacLean via complaints to the Commission, Moko and Adeka resisted the broader MacLean-Lettison network, undermining its power from within the familial and generational relationships they themselves were a part of. And it's not just familial power dynamics they contended with. Commission inquiries took place at Custom House, the centre of imperial power in Tortola, and this was a space that MacLean was intimately familiar with as comptroller, particularly compared to 4 kidnapped Africans that didn't even live in the capital road town. The culture of commission examinations increased the enmeshed nature of the MacLean network, as the apprentice and master occupied the same physical space of resistance and response. In partnership with this, their complaints emerged out of the literal heart of imperial power networks, the location where Custom House officials determined the fate of kidnapped Africans. It was here, in this space of imperiality, that these women contested their treatment as apprentices. And this contestation and resistance of this female network had far-reaching impacts. Evidence from the widespread bureaucratic attention that the MacLean case received, Moko and Adeka's catalysing remarks played a key role in destabilising the colonial network of the commissioners themselves. Now, from the very start, Moody and Dougan's working relationship was tense. They were deeply ideologically opposed. Dougan had adopted evangelical abolitionism, which directly contrasted Moody's commitment to slavery. Their continued contempt for one another was evidenced by their repeated disagreements over the nature of examination and interview techniques, arguments which repeatedly weighed down the commissioners' reports across the 7-year period. Their fraught and disintegrated relationship was literally inscribed onto the pages of the documents, like the June 1827 report, for example, which was literally divided into 2 columns with consistent overlays and interjections by Moody. Crucially, the fragmentation of this relationship repeatedly occurred with the MacLean case at the very centre. For example, Moody's need to control and his rejection of each of Dougan's solution to conclude the MacLean case, instead insisting that the apprentices be re-examined, caused tension. Dougan himself admitted that the MacLean case was the epitome of their fallout, and he actually resigned early on before being convinced to return. Therefore, Moko and Adeka's complaints were catalytic dominoes in the increasingly devolving relationship between the 2 commissioners. However, the fragmentation and destabilisation of masculine colonial networks actually extended beyond the commissioners' relationship. If we return to Rose Grimes' testimony and its consequences, this becomes really evident. Grimes resided with Mrs. Lettison and was a midwife to Moko and Emborio. She stated, quote, "Every care was taken of Moko, and she had been a white child. She considered Adeka, Selina, and Imbahawa to be, quote, bad girls who had run away for a long time." Like McLean had done, she villainized the resistive female network. Her testimony indicated her extensive previous relationship with the McLean family. She lived and worked with them. But as a non-family member, her testimony drew the Commissioner's focus, specifically for its religious elements. Outside of her relationship with the McLeans, she was a leader amongst the Methodists. This position was noted to lend validity to her testimony, but instead it prompted concerns for its truthfulness. And these concerns actually came from the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society themselves. Mr. Gilchrist, for example, was, quote, surprised at Grimes having taken such an oath and tried to, quote, induce her to communicate what had passed, as Mr. McLean had been represented to him as inimical to authorities. McLean then felt accused of having tampered with witnesses, with Gilchrist subsequently revealing that, quote, Mr. Dougan said that Mr. Moody was unfavourable to the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society. Religious authority here, and Gilchrist specifically, therefore became a tool for Dougan to criticise McLean, again further dividing him from Moody. With the confrontation no longer limited to kidnapped Africans in the McLean family, Mokoena-Decker's case therefore had an incendiary effect for wider religious and colonial tensions. This was particularly significant considering the solidification of the missionary presence in Tortola during the 18th and 19th centuries. Occupying a position, quote, closer to labourer than landowner, as said by Michael Creighton, they existed on the fringes of white society. And this social tension was then exacerbated further by the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society's criticism of the behaviour of white colonial society. In fact, it could have violent consequences. For example, Wesleyan minister John Bronwell was attacked in the streets of Rowtown after his critical letter was published in 1806, and later missionary reports of 1817 and 1824 again reiterated such tensions. These were clear demonstrations of how localised confrontations developed into a criticism of British colonial policy. And it's on that bed of political and religious conflict that the McLean confrontation laid. Importantly, the initial complaints of Mokoena-Decker's and Grimes' testimony subsequently exposed the fracturing relationships between colonial and religious authority on Tortola. Upholding shared ideologies and patterns of control were instrumental in maintaining masculine colonial hierarchies. So, if masculine colonial communities were as equally important for building imperial power as feminized support and advocacy was for engendering resistance, then religious subversion of this risked carving long-term impacts on colonial power hierarchies. And it's clear that masculine imperial networks themselves were riddled with their own contestations of power. In the practices of the Commission, Dougan continued to favour the missionary perspective, writing this explicitly into Commission reports. His preference instilled in writing an alternative masculine networks which favoured religious conclusions, as opposed to the imperial agents and colonial planters like Moody was. So across the complex 2-year case, Mokoena-Decker's complaints to the Commission had an extensive and significant impact. Although McLean escaped punishment by the 2 commissioners from Antigua, proving the ineffectiveness of the Commission in employing any real changes, these relationships reflected wider imperial conflicts concerning abolitionism and religion. Resisting their exploitation and confronting McLean from within imperial frameworks, they illustrated then their networks with fellow women and entanglements with McLean's wider networks. The resistive battleground of this hidden transcript catalysed further confrontations within fracturing patriarchal relationships. Thus, within exploitative frameworks that female kidnapped Africans were placed in under the guise of freedom in apprenticeship, Mokoena-Decker found space for confrontation and resistance as a collective. And it was the complexity and the collectivity of this case that really provoked my further exploration of the intricacies and intimacies of different resistive female networks on Tortola. So I've adapted this paper today from my master's thesis, and going forward, I'd like to focus on a singular aspect of that, the intimacies and conflicts of resistance and hierarchy between women stratified by status. This encompassed relationships of informal employment, provisions, and reproductive care, and these women existed in an interconnected web of support and resistance that emerged, again, from within British imperial structures. Their relationships were mapped within and against existing apprenticeship structures where the existence of these networks constituted a resistive alternative. when colonial power structures were not outrightly rejected, but rather utilised by free women of colour, a fundamentally masculine power framework became feminised. Free women engendered their own networks to both support other women in a non-uniform manner, as well as define their own freedom, legacies, and independence. This new pattern of leadership, equally complex and often hierarchical, existed within and against official apprenticeship ownership patterns. They simultaneously contended with the colonial reinscription of these female relationships into the arbitrary arrangements of apprentices and their relationships into the commission reports itself. The experiences and resistance of these women as rescuers and creators of refuges existed buried in the colonial bureaucratization of intimate relationships in the Commission archive. Therefore, delving deep into the intimacies and conflicts between free women, enslaved women, and kidnapped African women, I will position free women as rescuers and their homes as refuges. Sorry. So I want to think about the key themes I've just mentioned through the experiences of three significant women, Sally Keyes, Joan Sheen, and Mama Sally. As holders of enslaved and apprentice people, free women of colour were key intersections of important hierarchical networks within and against the colonial system. Tophia was apprenticed to John Gent, but the commissioners identified her in the possession of Sheen. Living with Sheen, Tophia described being well-fed and spoke of her kindness. But importantly, this unofficial apprenticeship relationship, evident in the language of the commission itself, provided space for Tophia to, quote, have time chiefly to herself and work to clothe herself and her child. And she characterised the relationship as one of nourishment, with space for leisure and independent labour. But in November 1822, however, Tophia was uprooted from Sheen and officially indentured to Thomas Hill. Again, she was uprooted. We're going to see that a lot. But free women of colour were good, bad, and indifferent mistresses of kidnapped Africans. Keyes was indicative of this spectrum. Olola, originally apprenticed to George Dix, then transferred to Keyes, did not express the fondness Tophia did for Sheen. While occasionally assisted by her, quote, very good mistress, likely the characterisation given by the commissioners, Olola was principally fed by her own labour, supporting herself. There was similar tension in Keyes's relationship with Nguba. She asserted that to both Keyes and the commissioners that she did not, quote, did not belong to her, that she is free. Like Tophia, Olola and Nguba were repeatedly uprooted, prompting rejections of movement and assertions about freedom amidst ambiguous ownership. Kidnapped Africans were treated as movable property from the moment of condemnation. It was not another middle passage, but rather an ingrained, stagnated exploitation. Apprentices underwent horizontal movements along a line of unfreedom, deceptively disguised as an emancipatory finish line. Kidnapped Africans certainly found sites of refuge and employment and provision, but as with Keyes, this did not eliminate the hierarchies that provoked resistance. Kidnapped Africans were repeatedly isolated from family and denied kinship rights. This denial was confronted with a resistive rejection as networks were nevertheless sought. For instance, Keyes argued Nguba was impudent and lazy, and Olola was disobedient, spending the majority of the time, quote, gossiping and visiting her country people. Each woman was criticised for their labour productivity and idleness, labels which Ruprecht stated were given to behaviour that constituted, a quote, an active refusal of voluntary servitude. And using Ruprecht, Keyes' accusation of idleness demonstrated the inherent resistance of these women, specifically a rejection of their position as apprentices. And in this context, Nguba's assertion that she did not belong to her became even more powerful. Exploring this idea of rejection, Olola's gossiping fostered and maintained relationships with other kidnapped Africans, her country people, which rejected the isolation of the mistress-apprenticeship relationship. This community ethos of belonging, Joseph Miller argued, was vital for enslaved women attempting to avoid being uprooted yet again. So, if intimacy was a strategy of resistance fundamental to belonging, then gossiping to maintain relationships was an active rejection of the possibility of being uprooted from kin by apprenticeship. A hidden transcript of connection, resistance, and rejection therefore bubbled beneath the commission's surface. And these community networks of interaction were fundamental to resisting a position of unfreedom that aimed to strip Olola of her familial or kinship ties. Elsewhere, choice was fundamental to resistance via female networks. After fleeing from the cruel Bez Chalwell, who, quote, cart-whipped her, Tortola was placed under the care of the Collector of Customs, a colonial official charged with managing all custom imports and exports on Tortola, including kidnapped Africans. She then found employment with Sophia Morton, a free woman of colour and a refuge from Chalwell's violence. Now, this relationship was importantly outside the apprenticeship structure. Previously refusing to go to Spanish Town in Virgin Gorda with another free woman, Tortola equally resented the collector placing her with Myrtilla Persia, an enslaved woman poised to cure her of her miserable condition in exchange for the benefit of her services. The commissioner's comments attributed power to Persia, who complained of Tortola being inattentive to her orders. Hierarchy, therefore, did not follow status, rather it blended across boundaries of enslaved, apprenticed, and free. But Tortola's rejection of these relationships and embrace of an employment relationship with Morton revealed a crucial point. Tortola embraced female connections when it was her who facilitated them, and so in rejected labour demands and refusals to concede to officials, women of colour claimed ownership over themselves. This practice of rejection for Tortola, just like it was for Lola and Nguba, allowed for a direct confrontation with unfreedom. Exploring this further, Tortola's relationships with the rejected women were contrived by the collector, a white man at the centre of colonial power. She rejected the networks of support the colonial system prescribed her in favour of her own. Her resistance emerged from within the colonial framework of power she experienced explicitly in the care of collector. By consistently rejecting his plans for her, she not only resisted her master, but also a broader imperial instrument for control. Elsewhere, free women, however, reaped the benefits of the labour and cultural knowledge of unfree women when providing rescue to them through employment, and this cannot be ignored. This was particularly evident when free women stopped receiving the advantages of these relationships brought to them, and this was epitomised by the relationship between Ogaza and Matilda Hackett. After being cart-whipped by her second master, she ran away with her two daughters, Sally and Polly. Finding her in want, Hackett was kind to her, and their relationship initially cast Hackett in the rescuer category, but a vaguely described change in character resulted in a quick relationship shift. Hackett declined keeping the apprentice any longer, and clear from Hackett, free women reaped the benefits of unfree women. Therefore, the shared notion of a black femininity between free black mistresses and apprentices cannot be overstated as a site of resistance. The non-linearity within Ogaza and Hackett's relationship suggested complexity in the role of free women as providers more broadly. Miller's concept of multiplicity was key here. Characterizing intimate communities with multiplicity, he contrasted them with the, quote, single homogeneous mass of unattached individuals. Opposing isolation was fundamental to the understanding the interconnected webs of networks recognizable in the Commission archive. The interconnected intimate communities was where intensity of belonging was found. And the creation of networks both across intimate female connections and within the intimate geographies of Tortola was a means of belonging. As female networks were fundamentally enmeshed with coloniality, resistance emerged from and through this intimacy. Thus, to forge such networks or break them in the case of Ogaza, these networks had to emerge out of and solidify despite the colonial power framework. Moving away from this, free women of colour also appeared as facilitators and refugees of runaways. This was apparent in the story of 26-year-old Maquanta, who was apprenticed to George Dix as a washer. Upon his death, she was transferred to his wife, who then apprenticed her to Mrs. Frett, which she, quote, objected to. In this period of turbulence, her 3-year-old son Jasper became sick with whooping cough. When the child's health improved, she refused to return to Frett. Maquanta detailed to the commissioners the female support networks that emerged in her and her son's flight from Frett. Keys, a free woman of colour, saw her crying in the street and directed her towards Mama Sally, an enslaved woman in her possession, who she could go and live with if she was quiet. Keys facilitated the knowledge spread necessary for Maquanta to find safe refuge with Mama Sally, and the partnership between these two women, although hierarchical, facilitated her relocation and the childcare that she needed. This network of support cross-defined status lines in Tortola, and this relationship allowed her to leave her sick child and go to St. Thomas, where she hired herself as an attendant. And it's Mama Sally's space of refuge and childcare that gave Maquanta the freedom to provide for herself and her child. Maquanta's case, therefore, illustrated the resistance and refusal kidnapped African women expressed against forced relocation. And this pattern was also indicated elsewhere by Ijogo, who was run away for a long time before Mr. Lloyd, from Mr. Lloyd prior to her indentureship to Maclean. She was harboured by Bella Martinella, an enslaved woman on President Hetherington's estate. Again, the home of an enslaved woman was a place of refuge from the clutches of apprenticeship exploitation. Importantly, enslaved women like Martinella and Mama Sally existed within colonial power structures, contending with their own immense risks. For Martinella in particular, who lived on the estate of Tortola's president, her home was literally and geographically framed by colonial power. The space of refuge she offered was at its centre. It was evident how these women resisted and circumvented colonial networks at the essence of their existence, the homes of slaveholders themselves. Although the very concept of running away involved resisting and circumventing the imperial system, it remained within its power. This was reflected by the ultimate outcome of Iesia, who ran away from Mr. McCullen 10 months after being examined by the commissioners. She then found safe refuge with Sheen. Like with Keys, the home of a free woman of colour appeared as a safe destination for a runaway kidnapped African. Unlike these women who forged and maintained networks against and outside apprenticeship structures, Sheen appeared to the commissioners in August 1823, offering to take her as an apprentice. A relationship that initially circumvented official apprenticeship structures was then mapped onto them. In creating spaces of rescue and refuge, these female networks demonstrated how a varied utilisation of colonial structures allowed for resistance to emerge from within. This resistive hidden transcript hence employed subversive workings of colonial power structures. And when these networks were mapped onto apprenticeship, as in the case of Sheen, these masculine structures of control became feminised. And within networks documented by the Tortola Commission, traditional female symbols of the mother and the midwife were really significant. Diminutives like mama were common, expressing familiarity and character qualities, instrumental to the mother image. And in the traumatic aftermath of the Middle Passage, enslaved apprentice and free people adopted people into kin-based relationships, often labelled fictive kinship, where motherhood and kinship were intertwined. For instance, in providing childcare to Maquanta, Mama Sally filled that mother role, albeit temporarily. In addition to concubinage or abuse, Orlando Patterson argued that enslaved women were equally sexually exploited as mother surrogates. And in being made to conform to these gendered constructions, free women too were victimised. And without dismissing Patterson's point entirely, it's important to qualify women's choice in these gender constructions, arbitrary or not. Mama Sally, for instance, volunteered in taking on the mother role for Jasper. Although free women's capability for motherhood were vulnerable to exploitation, this didn't eliminate their abilities to resist and act within this categorisation for their own will, or eliminate their abilities to do it for others. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that patterns of motherhood and fictive kinship were enmeshed with apprenticeship and resistance structures. And this was evident elsewhere. Wodoko, for example, who was reapprenticed to Frances Walters, a free woman of colour, stated that she was learning to read and that Walters did her good and was, quote, a mother to her. And claiming a kinship connection, Wodoko enacted a, quote, practice of freedom, an idea presented by Jessica Johnson, where women asserted freedom through kinship practices. Although language of kinship was often used to describe hierarchical master-slave relationships, if we take Wodoko's labels at face value, it demonstrated how education and a nurturing intimacy felt like motherhood to her. Now, the role of the midwife was complex and crucial, particularly when exploring the histories of Keyes and Sheen. Childbirth was a deeply emotional experience, creating intimate ties and communities. In reproductive spaces, or what Sasha Turner termed reproductive bodywork, women gained power via control over childbirth experiences, even if it was brief and informal. And the nature of this power made its development within colonial power networks possible and instrumental. Sheen, a rescuer and mistress, worked as a midwife. Sarah Wickham employed her to attend to Sharkobi, who was run away. So Wickham actually had no knowledge of the delivery itself. This illustrated how reproductive spaces were often removed from the oversight of mistresses, even if they did orchestrate the employment of the midwife. Discussing African relationships with colonial bureaucracy, Benjamin Lawrence categorised midwives as African intermediaries, a bridge between local communities and colonial authorities. Equally applicable to Tortola, midwives facilitated relationships within and outside apprentice-mistress relationships, providing support to women, but also acting as agents of masters and mistresses. And through their services, the colonial bureaucracy could permeate the reproductive sphere. But midwifery was also a female business and a means of financial provision. Sheen was sourced and paid. This was similar for Keyes, who was described as, quote, supporting herself as a midwife. Both women were deeply interconnected with the female apprentice networks, and their shared role as midwife suggested that this position facilitated such network creation. As Turner suggested, homes of healer women or midwives were where assistant networks flourished. Furthermore, as mistresses and midwives, they indicated how the business of midwifery were financially profitable enough to support numerous apprentices. And although they were positioned as intermediaries, midwives on Tortola were earners, where resistance was in successful business. And this was epitomised in the often physical separation of reproductive relationships from colonial oversight. And resistance, therefore, involved working along colonial lines to better their own position, creating a space for intimate networks and reproductive relationships to form within a colonial framework that puppeted midwives as intermediaries. If free women of colour used slave ownership as a, quote, tool of survival, like Danielle Terrazas Williams argued, midwifery then was another practice of freedom. It asserted their knowledge leadership and community interaction and ensured financial independence. They had to work within those structures of power, including reproductive spaces, to carve their own spaces of freedom. And if we return to the story I started this paper with, the importance of this autonomy was demonstrated by Rose Grimes. Appearing as a witness in the McLean case, she was a midwife paid for by McLean to care for Mokwe and Omborio. Her interconnection with the McLean family extended beyond being employed by them. She had lived with them and was clearly interconnected with the lives of free women. And that means their lives were precarious, and developing local knowledge and intimate kinship relationships were a necessity when building commercial ties and wealth. For Grimes, the McLean family did just that. Her affidavit expressed support for McLean and condemned Mokwe in Bahawa. The situation made Grimes' status as an intermediary clear, where she positively gained services from McLean but was isolated between the clashing networks. Despite the possibility Grimes did disapprove of their actions, her ties with the McLean family were instrumental commercially and personally, factors which no doubt determined her statement. And so midwives as intermediaries were not free from exploitation. In fact, it was her intermediary position that drove McLean to wield her as a testimonial tool for his own benefit. And therefore, Grimes' testimony must be read in the context of her survival and livelihood as a businesswoman in reproductive spaces. Therefore, just as the lives and networks of kidnapped African women were characterised by multiplicity, so were that of free women. No blanket of freedom was granted for them to find comfort in. Instead, they actively sought and maintained practices of freedom that were fundamentally interlinked with the lives of enslaved and apprenticed women. However, women of colour simultaneously contended with that colonial reinscription into the Commission reports. And the Commission's documentary processes unintendedly stitched this patchwork of female networks together. And this is an idea I want to conclude on. The Commission, however, it wasn't just a documentary bystander, but rather an organ of imperial and masculine control, which mirrored and exacerbated colonial hierarchies in those intimate spaces. It was a weapon of sexualized exposure, monitoring, and physical upheaval for kidnapped Africans. For instance, when Adeka testified to her poor treatment and insufficient provisions, the commissioners made her confirm it by lifting up her dress. In searching for evidence of mistreatment, the commissioners repeatedly used exposure to reveal, quote, body marks. Bodies were then treated as a canvas for evidence examination. And if I draw on the arguments of A.O.A. Coley, the, quote, sexual grammar of the colonial encounter was intertwined with colonial discourses on clothing, where the African female body was unclothed by colonial discourses. And in her colonial encounter, she was literally and metaphorically unclothed as her body was exposed to the commissioners, with this exposure then later inscribed into the archives. The Commission therefore did not only document or examine the battlefield of resistance networks, but rather worked with the tide of battle to strengthen imperial control. The examinations, like I said, took place in Custom House. The physicality of this colonial masculine space, dominated by the increasingly fracturing relationship between Commissioners Moody and Dougan, created a literal space of hierarchy that the examinations were born out of. Articulating their hidden transcripts amidst the violent intimacies that consequently emerged, kidnapped African women brought hidden transcripts into dangerous, hierarchical, and masculine spaces. And so, contending with the unsafe space, the Commission played a vital role in translating hidden transcripts into powerful and subversive public ones. Here, they contested the public transcript itself, as well as the systems that disseminated it. So, to conclude, networks of female kidnapped Africans existed extensively in Tortola in the early 19th century. As kidnapped Africans contended with the trauma, volatility, and violence of the Middle Passage and then apprenticeship, women sought connections across statuses. Some networks were small and isolated, operating within intimate relationships themselves. Others were large and complex, enmeshed with generational colonial hierarchies like the McLean network. Within these relationships, tracing lines of support illustrated how free women of colour appeared as rescuers and creators of refuges in the hidden transcript of kidnapped African women, often via employment or assisting runaways, albeit whilst occupying positions of authority. These women, like apprentice holders, worked within imperial masculine networks to offer support, often utilising the apprenticeship structures themselves to achieve this. Essentially, free women acted against imperial networks from within, but also employed colonial hierarchies to support other women and enact their own freedom practices. Therefore, in focusing on female networks through numerous lenses, confrontation, support, and violence, the varied nature of female networks were apparent. In their existence within and resistance to imperial structures, the multiplicity of these networks as women sought freedom were crucial in erasing the inflexible lines of the Commission reports. And so they demonstrate how each woman negotiated various levels of unfreedom that dictated their relationships to one another, where both support and confrontation existed concurrently. Thank you very much. I just got a bibliography and thank you for coming. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Amy. That was such an interesting presentation. And as Eve, well, I don't think anyone was here, but as Eve mentioned before, this was the first ever presentation on Tortola. So yeah, it's great to hear more about it. We're going to open up a Q&A session now. If you don't want your face or voice to be in this as it's recorded, you can just type your question in the chat, or if you're happy to be recorded, then you can just unmute yourself and ask the question. We have a first question in the chat from Abigail, who says, thanks for your presentation, Amy. Is there evidence of free Black women being paid for midwifery work? And did you find other forms of employment for them?
There was definitely evidence they were being paid in the Commission reports. The way it's like structured is with, I guess, it kind of changes throughout the period, but they have a section called like actual condition, which I noted on my slides, which is informed from what the kidnapped African said. And then there's like remarks, which are basically like, I guess, things that the commissioners have added that have like context. And particularly in the colonial office papers, there's personal notes of Dougan and Moody. And when they talk about people like Sally Keyes, there's kind of extensive description of her as somebody that as a businesswoman, somebody that's being paid. They often use the word of like she is subsisting or like has created a life for herself, like independently kind of through this service. In terms of other employment, there was not a lot of information. There was definitely hints to other kind of more informal relationships of employment, things like washing and cleaning and domestic chores. Agriculture as an employment wasn't really a thing. Actually, I think I didn't go into it too much, but I did note it is one of the reasons why it was so kind of big for this complaint to take place was because female apprentices were actually banned from doing any kind of agricultural labour. Obviously, was that ban followed? No. But it was only meant to be men that were employed in that sense. But so obviously you do find kidnapped African women in that, but not necessarily free women. And for me, I found it tricky to find kind of extra information on the free women. So people like Sally Keyes and Joan Sheen, it was very much reading against the grain because the Commission only really cared about kidnapped African women and obviously kidnapped African men, but I chose to focus on women. The Commission was specifically kind of set up to look at their state and condition and what that, I guess, structure was working as. For me, I just found when I read those reports and read those primary sources, there was so much like evidence and like rich information about these free women that were just kind of like dotted here and there. So like, for example, for Sally Keyes, I ended up finding quite a bit about her, obviously enough that I've, spoken about it in this presentation today, but I probably found only a sentence or two on her in like 5 or 6 different reports. It was very much like kind of piecing it together like a puzzle. And particularly with the kidnapped African women in the schedules, basically like almost like the 19th century version of a spreadsheet, kidnapped African women were listed by their African name, which I use today, and by their English name. But in all of the National Archive papers, they were only referred to by their English name. So you have to kind of work backwards, which made it tricky. But I've gone on a bit of a tangent from your question, but there was definitely a lot of evidence for other free women as well. But I didn't mention them here today. And mainly, I didn't include them in my thesis, mainly because I couldn't back it up. If you see it once or twice, particularly if they're referred to by different names, it feels like you can't, avoid the conclusion or the risk that actually could be a different person.
Thanks, Amy. Does anybody else have a question? Feel free to just unmute yourself or type in the chat. Abigail says, thank you very much. Yes, it was interesting to see the African names as well.
Yeah, I might not have, I apologize if I have said those incorrectly. I did a lot of research and not all of them, I think, are still in circulation as names. So I definitely did my best.
I actually had a question about when you mentioned about agriculture and how free women were not allowed, well, they were not meant to agriculture. Is there a specific reason for that?
In terms of free women could actually, I might have misrepresented that, could do whatever they wanted, but obviously culturally maybe not. But for kidnapped African women, I don't know the reason why. Basically, when the apprenticeship kind of, I guess, I don't know, parameters, maybe is the word to use, were introduced when apprenticeship started in the Act of Abolition, is included in the Act. There was lots of different stipulations, that the things that they could, things that they couldn't do. For example, apprenticeship was meant to be temporary. It was meant to be a period of 7 years that then once that was completed, you wouldn't be an apprentice anymore and you would be free. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Most people, like I said, were held in either like fake or like unofficial in contracts, so to say. And that wasn't so they would never really escape after that 7 years. It just wasn't a thing, or they would be renewed for whatever purpose. And basically, it comes out of apprenticeship structures that were actually the case for poor working class boys in England. So people that might have been like in mines or mills, things like that. It kind of emerges out of those structures. So men, for example, you have to learn a trade. The same for women. You're meant to be an apprentice for 7 years to learn a trade and come out of it ready to be like enter the world, basically. So women, that trade had to be domestic based. So it had to be, I'm a washer, I'm a seamstress, I'm this, I'm that. And for men, you either had to be in agriculture or you had to go in the military. And the reason why this project kind of really naturally took a direction towards focusing on women, which I knew I wanted to do, but I picked Tortola out of the commission because that took place across the Caribbean. Like I said, the Antiguan commissioners came over. Was because on Tortola, lots of the men were taken into naval service. So when this commission inquiry took place, there was actually a really heavy majority of women that they interviewed because there was a female majority on Tortola of like the kidnapped African population. So in terms of the responsibilities in agriculture and things like that, that's what I gathered. But they didn't necessarily justify it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. That was really helpful. Does anyone else have any questions? Anissa, I can see that you're unmuted. Did you have a question? No, or you can type it in the chat if not. Nobody. Well, in that case, we can, if nobody has a question, we can wrap up. But what we can do is that Amy will still be on and the recording will stop. So we can have a bit more of an informal chat with Amy if anyone would like to stay on. And then, yeah, Deanna would have stopped the recording by then. So you can feel free to turn your cameras off or cameras on, sorry, and just informal chat with Amy. But yeah, thank you so much to everybody, to Amy, especially to Deanna, to Eve, and yes, as Deanna's put in the chat, if you'd like to take part in the next Caribbean seminar series, which starts in September, then please send your title and abstract to Eve. And yeah, this will be shared out and go online, this recording as well. So please feel free to share it around your networks as well. And thanks, Amy, once again for such a fantastic presentation.
No, thank you, Sabrina and Deanna, for all of your support and coming along.